I'm Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty, and we've decided to do a podcast called We Don't Have to Choose. Why that title? Well, several years ago, I heard Rachel Barco give a presentation at the University of Minnesota, and she said that if the criminal legal system was a private corporation, it would have been bankrupt years ago. And that got me to thinking, why? Why does the criminal legal system not work to keep us safe? And what will keep us safe? That's what we're going to talk about on the podcast, that we don't have to choose between public safety and reform or changes or advancement, that those things we are trying to do here at the Hennepin County Attorney's Office will bring us public safety. Thank you, Radley, for joining us on the We Don't Have to Choose podcast. Radley, I think I first became aware of you when I read the book, The Rise of the Warrior Cop. And then I started following your work. You worked at the Washington Post. You currently have a Substack. You've written another book on forensic science. Can you tell us just a little bit about your background?
Sure. So, see, how far back should I go? I grew up in Indiana. I very, very conservative, extremely white county in suburban Indianapolis. Went to a big state school. Was very sort of conservative in my politics when I got out of college. Worked for a far right nonprofit group that scared the hell out of me, and discovered that maybe I'm a libertarian. Let's see, I did what a lot of people in their 20s do when they take a job they don't like, which is I went to law school. Was in law school for a year. I really liked the intellectual rigor, but I knew I wanted to write for a living, and I was seeing the debt mount up, and seeing 10 years at a horrible firm working ridiculous hours. So I dropped out. I'll skip forward ahead. I ended up at the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank in DC, where I did. I was a policy analyst on civil liberties and the drug war, and that's kind of where I first started encountering the issues that I think would kind of motivate or animate the rest of my career. And in particular, I kept reading about these raids where police, would serve drug warrants by kicking down doors and shoot the dog and shoot people and get the wrong house frequently. And so I ended up writing a paper for Cato on that issue. And then in the course of doing that, I found this particular case in Mississippi where this guy, Corey May, had shot and killed a police officer during a botched raid on his home. And to me, he seemed almost certainly innocent, that he thought these were criminal invaders coming to harm him and his daughter. But he was on death row at the time. And so I ended up writing about his case for Reason magazine, a libertarian magazine. They ended up hiring me full time. And so I became kind of a full-time investigative reporter, which is what I've done since. So I eventually end up working then for the Huffington Post for a while. And I write my first book, Rise of the Warrior Cop, about these police militarization issues. Get hired by the Post and was there for about 10 years. And then wrote about the second book co-wrote it with Tucker Carrington, the director of the Mississippi Innocence Project. And that actually also stemmed from the Corey May case. The medical examiner in that case, Stephen Hain, gave really dubious testimony to help convict Corey. And so I started poking around with him and found that this guy had been doing, insane numbers of autopsies, like 1,800, 2,000 autopsies a year in Mississippi and Louisiana, sent a lot of people, innocent people, to prison. So we ended up writing a book about all of that. Since I left the Post, I've been kind of doing my own thing, still doing the investigative reporting, doing some freelancing. I've got my own newsletter, as you mentioned, on Substack. Just handed in a manuscript for my third book, which is about public defenders. So that's
I know Tucker Carrington. Yeah, I've done some training in Mississippi for Gideon's Promise when I was a public defender.
Tucker is one of my favorite people on the planet. He is
good. He's
person.
Wonderful.
So let's go back. I think the fact that you were in law school for a year probably helps people understand why you have such an excellent framework on the war on drugs and the rise of the warrior cop, particularly on Fourth Amendment issues. But I want to talk about so police didn't look the way they do now. They didn't have the equipment that they do now. What accounted for that? How did we get from where they were before to what we currently see today?
Yeah, so I always like to preface this by saying we should be careful about sort of pining for a time that didn't really exist. So that there's this tendency, and I've been guilty of it too, of saying we went from officer friendly to officer commando or officer tattoo Oakley's steroid cowboy door kicker cop. And there, I think there are reasons to think in some ways that police have improved in the last 30, 40 years, which is that, how internal affairs departments, there is somewhat more accountability than there used to be, at least, prior to, I would say, the last 7 or 8 years. You couldn't be openly racist in law enforcement. And that may be changing now, changing back. But I think the thing that we have seen, unquestionably, is the sort of default amount of force that police use as a matter of policy, right? So we've seen from, in the late 70s, Peter Kraska, the criminologist at Eastern Kentucky, did a number of surveys for about 10 years on all of this. And so what we found is in the 70s, the number of SWAT team deployments per year in the U.S., I think was around a few hundred, right? And it was in these types of situations where I think SWAT is appropriate, which is when you have, a bank robbery or a hostage situation or a terrorist incident, where lives are at immediate risk, right? And you have to use violence to save people's lives. By the early 80s, the number of SWAT deployments was up to about 3,000. And when Kraska stopped doing these studies by the early 2000s, he estimated that we were somewhere around 30,000 deployments per year. And we're probably, 50 or 60 now, if the trends have continued. And so the main driver of that is the war on drugs. And the, SWAT teams went from being used in these emergency sorts of situations where you're using violence to diffuse an already violent threat to using them to serve drug warrants, for pretty low level offenses. And so you're using force and violence and volatility, and you're creating all of those things where they didn't exist before, right? You're kicking somebody's door down in the middle of the night and forcing this very violent, potentially violent confrontation. And that's, that is a major shift in policing, in the relationship between police and the community, between sort of how we view, what legitimate use of law enforcement force is. And it happened under the guise of the drug war. It happened with, there's a little bit of backlash as it started happening, but there was never really any public debate about it, right? I mean, it just kind of happened as we got caught up in drug war fervor. And I think that's kind of where we are now. I mean, it's never really been rolled back. I mean, the Obama administration did a little bit of kind of passed a few sort of symbolic policies in terms of the type of military equipment that could be transferred from the Pentagon to local police departments. But it was mostly, it was important in that it was signaling that finally a U.S. president was saying, okay, this is a problem. Police militarization is a problem. And, we at least acknowledge that much, even if we're not going to do much to actually fix it. But all of the policies that they passed were quickly reversed by the Trump administration, and it's all gotten a hell of a lot worse now. So,
Well, we've also had an evolution in, I guess, interpretation of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the Fourth Amendment around this. Can you talk a little bit about that?
yeah, so I mean, constitutional scholars talk about the drug war exception to the Fourth Amendment, and it's this idea that, and this is going to sound very familiar to anybody who's been following the headlines lately, which is that in the 80s, the courts basically determined that drugs, illicit drugs, were such a threat to the country that they basically, I think Reagan at one point declared them a threat to national security. Anytime you declare war on something, you are kind of conditioning the country, the public, to be prepared to make sacrifices, and included among those sacrifices are sacrificing some of your basic civil liberties, right? Because this threat is so existential that we're going to have to, set some things aside in order to defeat it. And so that's what we saw, throughout the 1980s, 1990s. We saw this in, and basic public policy. We saw it. I get into some of this in the Warrior Cop book. I mean, some of the proposals that you saw floating around in Congress at the time were just mind-boggling. Things like, sending drug addicts to, deserted islands in the middle of the Pacific. There were, proposals to make it illegal for defense attorneys to be paid by their clients if there was evidence their clients were involved in the drug trade. At one point, there was even like anyone who accepts any money from somebody who's later convicted of drug dealing could be charged with a felony. So, including dry cleaners and gas station attendants. And so there was just this really big push. And then the courts, endorsed a lot of it. I mean, the courts really rolled back the Fourth Amendment. I mean, you can read William Brennan's dissents over the years, getting increasingly angry and finally just kind of throwing his hands up. And at one point, I think in one case, he finally says, the drug war's victory over the Fourth Amendment is now complete. And, we've seen this continue, I think, even today. And now, of course, there's a new threat, right? Which is immigration, or alleged threat. And Trump has declared, immigrants a threat to national security. He's declared immigrants to be invading the country. And again, that language, prompts the courts to show an enormous amount of deference to the executive. And that results in the scenes that we've seen, in the videos that we've seen of people, tackling people in the streets, kicking down doors, raiding people, arresting people without probable cause. I mean, this is all stuff we saw in the 80s and 90s also. I mean, we saw the National Guard sending helicopters out to remote areas of California and literally invading entire towns because they suspected there was illegal pot farms happening. We saw the exact same thing with immigration, literally on a pot farm in California. I think the main difference is that in the 80s, you could make a good case that the crack epidemic was a very serious threat to public health. I mean, a lot of people were overdosing and dying. There were a lot of turf wars and black market wars over territory when crack kind of came on the scene. I think there's a good argument you can make that crack was the product of bad drug policy, but, there was no question that this was a problem that needed to be addressed. Whether, I think that was the wrong way to address it. I mean, the big difference today is that, immigration is not a problem. It's not a national emergency. It's not a crisis. There was a time, I guess, when we were having more illegal border crossings at one point during the Biden administration, but that was falling when Trump took office the second time. And crime has been falling. And there's no evidence that undocumented immigrants or documented, all the evidence shows they commit crimes at a lower rate than natural born citizens. So this time, we're seeing a lot of parallels, but this time, even the kind of national emergency facade underneath it all is, I don't know if you permit swearing on your podcast.
Yes.
Everything used to justify it is bullshit. And that's kind of where we are now.
That's pretty low level swearing. Aside from that,
I could do.
So I think that all of those things have a common theme, and that is fear.
Yeah.
In fact, like the whole thing with immigrant, we do not have immigrants pouring over the borders to commit crime. I mean, all of that is ridiculous. But I look back and I see a lot of justifications for the militarization of police. Also for, I've certainly looked at any number of search warrants, as you have, for permission for police to execute a warrant on a house that allegedly has drugs. And here, years ago, when I was a public defender, we were actually able to make the case that all of the language was boilerplate.
Oh, yeah.
Police were, but what they used on it was people who use drugs are known to carry weapons.
Yeah.
And it was all language designed to convince, which didn't have to be very much convincing to a judge to sign off on that warrant. And I think it also goes along with, so this, I'm going to go on the side. I've always, actually, I tried to use this comparison in a college class several years ago, and it fell flat because I looked out at an audience of 100 college students and I said, "How many of you are familiar with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid?" And one of them raised their hand and said, "My parents watched it, I
Yeah.
think."
Yeah.
And so, but I think for those audience members who do remember it, Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid were criminals. You could refer to them as criminals. They were robbers. They killed people. That's what they did for a living. Yet they were played by Paul Newman and Robert Redford, two of the most handsome, highest, stars in Hollywood. And I vividly remember the last scene in the movie where they're holed up in a church in South America, and they think that there are a small number of police outside, the equivalent of police back then outside. And so they decide they're going to shoot it out. They burst open the door, they fire guns. Unbeknownst to them, a whole army is out there. And they are, because this was a true story, killed. But they don't show that in the movie. And I'm convinced they don't show that in the movie because no one wanted to see Robert Redford or Paul Newman killed. They just didn't. They wanted to see them burst out the door in a, glory of, not being killed. In the drug war, we were just inundated with pictures and images of who those people were. And so many of them, the portrayal was Black men who we were supposed to think of as being dangerous. And those portrayals changed a lot. And I fully believe that lots of information that we are inundated with is designed to make us fearful and designed to make us accept these kinds of things that are happening when we wouldn't normally, hopefully, allow that to happen to people who are our neighbors.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's about dehumanization, right? It's you in order for the public to be okay with going to war with someone, and you could argue that it's only rhetorical when we talk about the drug war, but it's become pretty literal, including in the war on undocumented people. You have to dehumanize people dehumanize kind of the enemy in air quotes before people are going to be comfortable going to war with them. So yeah, we saw that throughout the drug war. I mean, Nixon, I can't remember one of his top aides. I can't remember. Ehrlichman, right? In his interview with Dan Baum, the journalist who wrote the definitive history of the drug war, a great book called Smoke and Mirrors, which came out in the 90s, but still I think is extremely important. But in an interview, he flat out said, we knew we were lying. We knew that the whole point of the drug war was to lump Black people, civil rights activists, hippies, and anti-war activists all in the same, paint them all with the same brush and drugs were the way that we did that. And that would appeal to white middle-class voters who, didn't like any of those groups. And, he just flat out admits it, comes out and says it. And we see this during the Reagan administration with, demonization of drug offenders and drug users and drug addicts and drug dealers. And of course, now we see it again, the parallels to the current situation with undocumented people, with Trump, calling them vermin and saying they poison the blood of the country. I mean, frankly, I think, Lee Atwater, the famous apparatchik of the Republicans in the 80s and 90s, that gave us the Willie Horton at him. I think even him at his worst would look at, what Trump was saying about undocumented people and be like, come on, man, that's a little the top, isn't it? I mean, it's just the rhetoric has gotten so out of hand. And that's why, you get, hundreds of people, thousands of people holding up mass deportation signs now at the mass deportation now signs at the Republican convention. It's why, you go log on to X and you see these ICE videos of ICE people, terrorizing grandmothers and children and people cheering it on and, getting really excited about it. You get people like, Dean Cain, the actor who, doesn't need a job, but apparently announced yesterday that he's joining ICE because he saw these videos and decided, you know what, I don't need the money, but I just want to, that's what I want to do. I want to do what they're doing in these videos. I mean, I've long been a, it can't happen here kind of person. I thought that we had kind of the institutional strength and the fortitude and the history and the tradition to, that fascism wouldn't happen here. And now I'm worried. If I were to place a bet, I would bet on the side of it happening here than it not happening here at this point. And I think a big part of that is just this willingness to embrace the kind of demonization of the other. Like you said, it's we all it, it's the oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook, right? You find marginalized, sort of easily demonized groups of people, and you turn the majority against them. And I think that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, I wanted to circle back to to search warrants, particularly to no-knock warrants. In fact, actually, you're chuckling. I was actually going to go off on a tangent about my frustration with moderate Democrats either jumping on board or being afraid to stand up to the current rhetoric. But that would be a big aside.
It's just I'm continued. Yeah, I mean, sorry, I know I want to get back to search warrants too, but I mean, you see things like there's a story a few weeks ago about a Little League coach who, ICE agents started talking to his team and trying to sort of talk about, give away their parent if they were undocumented. And he stood up to them and he made them leave, and it's like, that guy has shown more courage than the top big law firms, Paramount, Brown, Harvard. I guess Harvard's actually done a fairly decent job of standing up to them, but definitely Brown, Penn, Columbia. I mean, the people who have the least amount of power and who are, the most easily sort of cast aside and marginalized are the people who are showing the most courage right now. And the people who, have platforms and have money and have political power are rolling over. And it's been really dispiriting and deflating to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
I mean,
yes, the Washington Post, the New York Times. Yes. So circling back, because I know you've actually done a lot of work on Minneapolis, particularly you analyzed how it was that there was this narrative out there about George Floyd. And I want to get to that. But first, I want to talk about no-knock warrants, because that was of particular concern and interest here in Minneapolis when Amir Locke was shot and killed when the police were executing a no-knock warrant. Can you talk about what is a no-knock warrant and what was the evolution to get there?
Yeah. So, we have this tradition in U.S. law that dates back to English common law called the Castle Doctrine. And it's kind of been a little bit co-opted and distorted over the years through the gun rights debate. But traditionally, the Castle Doctrine was that stated that the home should be a place of peace and sanctuary, right? And so the government, the king in England, should not be able to violate that peace and sanctuary without ample justification and having a clear purpose. And they should have to knock, the king's men, the government should have to knock and announce itself and its purpose before coming into your home and give you the opportunity to avoid violence to your person and destruction of your property. And that tradition is, been held for a very, very long time. The violations of it during the colonial era in the U.S. are why the big reason why we had a revolution, because the colonists in places like Boston were really angry because British soldiers were kicking down their doors to look for contraband and untaxed goods. These writs of assistance or general writs, which let them kind of do this whenever they want without specific information that particular person had committed a crime. It's why we have the Fourth Amendment. It's why we have the Third Amendment. You could argue it's why we have the Second Amendment. They were really angry about these searches of private property and private residence. And at the time, the Castle Doctrine still applied, back in England. They just weren't, granted those protections if you lived in the colonies. So we have the revolution, we get these amendments. And so for a long time, this kind of held, police could still kick down your door if they got to your home and they heard, someone being, tortured or murdered inside, or if they looked through your window and saw that you had, noticed them and were getting a gun and loading it, if there were
exigent circumstances,
like exigent circumstances at the scene, a hostage taking situation, they could come in without knocking. What happened is, I think it was New York first did it at the state level, and maybe like the mid '60s during the Rockefeller era. They passed a law that made a no-knock raid or no-knock drug warrant service a policy that you could attain ahead of time, right? You could go to a judge ahead of time and say, we need this because, the police need this protection because this person is especially dangerous. It was really not used at all after that law did pass, but it was barely used at all. And I think one thing that's important to remember about no-knock raids is that they were never something that police were clamoring for or demanding. They weren't saying like, we need this to be able to do our jobs properly. It became a national issue because there was a guy named Don Santorelli. It was a 30, I think he was 32 maybe, Senate staffer who was recruited to the Nixon campaign. I interviewed him for my book. And his job was to basically come up with issues that would be wedge issues that, the Nixon campaign could use to appeal to middle-class white voters. And so they came up with the no-knock raid as a way of showing like that we're tough on crime, right? We think police should, if you're doing drugs, police should be able to kick down your door and, throw a gun in your face and arrest you and take your drugs away. And it was a way of showing, this is how serious we are about fighting this war on drugs. So it became a big issue in the '68 campaign. I'm giving you the really long version, but I do think there's some important lessons in this. So I think it was in '71, maybe, Congress passes a no-knock raid bill that authorizes the use of these tactics for federal police officers, federal narcotics officers, and then police in D.C., because Congress has jurisdiction over D.C. So in D.C., they actually had a pretty progressive, for his time, police chief at the time, who refused to use it. He said, "This is going to put my officers at risk. If somebody's dangerous, we think bursting in the middle of the night is, going to make things more dangerous for officers. And actually, even if they're not, because it elicits a very primal response in people. And you know what, in terms of like getting in before the evidence is destroyed, which is another of the exigent circumstances. If you don't have enough cocaine in your house, if the amount is small enough that you can flush it down the toilet before we get inside, then you know what? We got those drugs up the street, right? And you're probably not somebody who's worthy of these tactics anyway. You're not a big enough player. So he refuses to. It's a very different story at the federal level. Federal narcotics officers start kicking down doors left and right. They use this as just carte blanche to do whatever they want. And there's this backlash. People are wrongly raided. People are killed. Innocent people are killed. Federal officers are killed. And Congress holds hearings on this in the '70s, and it's fascinating to read the press coverage of this when it was happening. And they were capable of showing some shame and remorse, and they actually repealed the bill authorizing no-knock raids at the federal level. Then Reagan comes in the '80s, and Congress never reauthorizes the no-knock raid. It kind of just becomes sort of part of accepted practice, and the federal courts really don't rein them in. State courts don't rein anyone in. And it just becomes this kind of very common tactic in the drug war without there ever really being the sort of public debate and discussion that there was in the '70s. It becomes kind of the default way to serve drug warrants at jurisdictions around the country. So Supreme Court has a number of cases. The first one was Wilson versus Arkansas in 1996. And that one, the court reaffirms the Castle Doctrine. They say this is part of the Fourth Amendment, but that knock and announce is required. It's part of the Fourth Amendment unless you can get this no-knock raid ahead of time, no-knock warrant ahead of time. But they say that there are these exigent circumstances that let police get around the requirement and get around the Castle Doctrine. The exigent circumstances are what we've already talked about, right? If the police think that knocking and announcing will allow someone to, somebody who's dangerous to get a gun and threaten them or hurt people inside the house, they can break in without knocking. They think the person will dispose of evidence, they can break in without knocking. And if they think the person will flee, they can break in without knocking. So these are, gaping wide exceptions, loopholes that basically overwhelm the rule. And so all police really have to do is show even the slightest bit of evidence that this particular person, meets one of these exigent circumstances, and they can get around the Castle Doctrine. But it turns out police can't even do that. They can't even meet these really basic requirements. And so what they do is they start cutting and pasting just boilerplate language, like you mentioned that you saw as a public defender. about how all drug dealers are dangerous and all drug dealers are a threat to dispose of evidence. And so the court says, no, you can't do that.
I think most people think, understandably, well, okay, police officers are supposed to make a specific showing, or they have to get a judge. If there are no exigent circumstances and they're trying to get a warrant, a judge needs to sign it.
Yeah.
So isn't it great that we have this judicial protection, making sure that officers are making the showing that they need to make? And we've talked a little bit about the boilerplate language, which, by the way, judges just signed off on here. And I think in a previous conversation, you told me about something you learned about a judge.
Yeah.
Can you tell people about it?
Yeah. I was getting to that. I was just, I have this tendency to want to explain, the entire history. But yeah.
I know nothing about that.
Yeah.
That
So
never happens to me.
yeah. So, we think judges are supposed to be these guardians of the Fourth Amendment. They're going to apply all the Supreme Court standards and case law and hold police to account. And, what ends up happening is they just become rubber stamps. And the judges who do, their duty and protect the Fourth Amendment and hold police accountable and make them explain themselves, the police just avoid those judges and go to the ones who don't. And they're allowed to do that, apparently. So what we found is, so in 2006, in this case, Hudson versus Michigan, the court acknowledged in that case that the police had violated this person's Fourth Amendment rights and violated the knock and announce rule. But Scalia, who wrote the majority, decided, it was a 5-4 case, decided, well, we're not going to use the exclusionary rule here. We're going to let you use this incriminating evidence anyway. And those of us at the time we were worried that this meant police were going to be able to kind of just do this with impunity, right? There was now no penalty for not violating people's Fourth Amendment rights when it comes to breaking into their homes. And that's exactly what we've seen. And so this boilerplate language, even though it's clearly illegal under Supreme Court precedent, we see it all the time. And so when I started looking into Little Rock because I was sent a video of this incredible drug raid where the police had actually attached this explosives to this person's door. And this was in an apartment complex. And he had a Ring camera on the inside of his apartment. And so you see him, he's actually asleep on the couch with his dog. And you see the door just fly off the hinges and actually hits him. It flies across the room and hits him as he's on the couch. And the police come storming in. And so I started looking into it, and I found that, the police were doing this regularly. They were using explosives on all these really low-level drug cases. And then this guy named Roderick Talley, he was angry about what happened to him. And so he figured out that actually on the Arkansas court system, you could do a search on an officer's name and find all the cases that they had been involved in. And so he sent me a stack of 100 search warrants that have been served over the last year and a half in Little Rock. And as I started going through it, it was just, it kind of blew my mind. I mean, I think it was 98% of the warrants were no-knocks. And these were for, very low-level drug offenses. We also found that the police were using informants who were blatantly lying to them. And pretty solid evidence, I think I can say, that the police also were lying. I mean, if you send an informant to somebody's home and the informant comes back and says, I bought, a bunch of crack from this person, and then you raid the place and there's no crack, and you also don't have the crack that the person claimed to have bought. I'm pretty sure that there's a good argument to be made there that the police were complicit in a lie. And so what we found is that they were using boilerplate language in all of these cases. They were just cutting and pasting the same language. The judges were giving, signing off on these violent no-knock raids based on that boilerplate, no specific evidence at all about each person. And I was floored when I saw this. I mean, I guess I wasn't surprised, but to see it so blazing and so, just complete disregard of what the law actually was, I found kind of shocking. And then you factor that in with the violence that was used to carry out these particular raids. And then you look at what they found in them. I mean, I think, I can't remember what the percentage was. It's a pretty high percentage. They found nothing, but a lot of times they claimed they were going to find meth or heroin or crack, and they found, personal use amount of pot. It was pretty outrageous. And so I ended up calling the two judges who signed off on all these warrants. And I said, these warrants are illegal. I mean, I can I've talked to multiple constitutional scholars about this. I can send you the, the Supreme Court cases, and they just flat out disagreed. They just said, no, of course they're not illegal. I wouldn't have signed it if it was illegal. I was really kind of taken aback at just how insistent they were that this was perfectly fine and there was nothing wrong with any of this. One of the judges even told me, and I'm still just I'm shocked when I think about it. She says, "Well, you don't know what a detective might have told me on the phone that isn't in the search warrant affidavit." And I was like, that isn't evidence. Like that is, if they told you something on the phone that's not in the affidavit, that is not evidence that you can consider when signing a search warrant. I mean, it has to all be in the record. You can't have, I don't know what the legal term is for it, but these side conversations where wink and a nod. No, we've really got more than this. We just didn't put it in there because we're, I don't know, lazy, or maybe we obtained this information illegally. And so for a judge to openly say that she had considered this evidence that wasn't in the record in these cases, and, not like, off the record, you don't know, but it was just like, sort of like you silly journalist who doesn't know how things actually work in the real world. And, it's not just Little Rock. I mean, we found this there was a raid in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, where the police shot this guy multiple times. Really, I mean, he somehow survived, but, really his life is ruined. I think he's paraplegic now and, lost multiple organs. And that was one of these task forces, multi-jurisdictional task forces. And during the depositions for that lawsuit, you had officers on this task force flat out admit that they used boilerplate language in all these warrants, that every warrant service was a no-knock raid, regardless of the evidence. They didn't even have a policy for knocking and announcing. In that case, almost every officer on the task force claimed that they knocked and announced multiple times before they broke into this guy's house. He had a surveillance video camera, and it showed, no, it was seconds, after they showed up on his porch that they broke down the door. North Carolina, there was just an academic study a few years ago, found the same thing. The police used boilerplate language, that there was very little scrutiny from judges. After Breonna Taylor, DOJ did an investigation, found the same thing. There was I'll shut up after I tell this because I think this is a really a fascinating little anecdote. I spoke to a graduate student whose graduate thesis was he embedded basically with the Louisville Police Department and accompanied them on these raids. And he found the same thing, that almost every warrant service was a no-knock raid, that there's very little specific evidence about why this person met the exigent circumstances. But the really interesting thing is that he also noted that there were only about 4 or 5 raids that they went on where the person they were apprehending was actually dangerous, right? Had a record. And in those meetings, the SWAT meetings ahead of time, the police would talk about how this person was dangerous. And so this time they had to be sure to make sure to knock and announce themselves so that this person, wouldn't open fire on them when they broke in. So in other words, when the person, was an actual threat to the police officers, which is supposed to be the only reason why you use these tactics, they would use surround and call out. They would put a bunch of police around the house, get on a megaphone, announce themselves, and give them the person time to come out and surrender peacefully because they were afraid for their own safety.
Yeah, and that brings me around. I mean, you mentioned Breonna Taylor, but certainly the case that resonated with people here was Amir Locke. Mm-hmm. And that speaks to so many problems with this use of no-knock warrants. But as we've seen in the video, the police just open up a door. Amir Locke is just a guest there. He's not somebody that they're looking for. In fact, they have no idea. They could have used surveillance to figure out whether the person they were looking for was actually in there. But they burst open the door and kick the couch where Amir is sleeping. And he wakes up to see people coming in screaming at him. And he had a gun and just lifted the gun and they shot him in seconds. And it's this, I mean, to me, it seems, I mean, I find the stories interesting that you're talking about where police will actually admit, hey, these aren't safe for us either, because they're breaking into a home and so many Americans have guns.
Yep.
And what do you really expect from somebody who's sound asleep, who thinks an intruder is coming through their door? What else? And they have a gun. What do you expect? But I'm interested in your take on the idea that, there was supposed to have been a ban on no-knock warrants here, but clearly there wasn't. And also, it was found, given the law on charging police officers for excessive use of force, which only looked at the exact moment that the use of force was used, that officers are frequently putting themselves in these situations where they didn't need to be, and then being able to say, oh, he picked up a gun and he pointed it in my direction and I shot him. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, there's this idea of should police be protected when they instigate a situation that then leads to a justified use of force, right? And the courts have not been particularly sympathetic to that argument on behalf of the people shot by the police, unfortunately. But I do think that, yeah, in this case, where you are, well, I'll give you an example. So I'm doing a podcast right now with The Intercept about old drug war deaths and preventable deaths and like what we can learn from them now. And one of them is this case in New York from 2006, 2003, I think, Alberta Sproul. She was this 50-something-year-old city worker, a church-going woman, was preparing for work one morning and the police broke down her door, deployed a flash grenade, and she had a heart attack and died. And one of the things that came out on that at the time is that New York police were conducting these raids just left and right. I think there'd been like a 400 or 500% increase in the number of these kinds of raids over the last 5 or 10 years. And they were frequently getting the wrong apartment because they were relying on, dirty information from informants, rival drug dealers, people who'd been arrested, drug addicts themselves. And there was a civilian review board in New York at the time. And, it was not a great civilian review board, but it's better than none at all. But one thing that they found is that they could only judge the officer's actions in one of these raids based on, like you said, sort of at the moment, right? Like, did they do everything right in terms of procedure? Did they, did they knock the appropriate number of times and wait the right amount of time? If somebody was shot, was the officer justified at that moment in whether or not they should shoot someone? What they were prohibited from looking at was everything leading up to the raid, right? Was this informant reliable? Did they double check the information? Did they do basic surveillance to make sure that they had the right apartment? Did anyone actually stop and say, hey, is this level of a force appropriate for somebody who, we suspect might have a few ounces of pot, right? That's a question that never gets asked. There's just never an evaluation of whether this amount of force is appropriate. And the courts have shown little interest in second guessing police on that either. So yeah, I think that there is this major problem with how the courts look at these cases, how these cases are reviewed in hindsight. I did a series on policing in South Carolina with a number of these kinds of raids where people ended up dead and people who were, innocent ended up dead. And I have video literally of, there's a group in South Carolina called SLED. It's basically kind of the state police. It's an elite police agent, considered an elite police agency, and they review all the police shootings. And there was one particular case where this woman was killed when the police raided her home. It's pretty clear that she wasn't trying to kill a bunch of cops. It's pretty clear she thought that people were invading her house and she was trying to defend herself. And they're interviewing this officer from SLED, whose entire job is to investigate police, officer involved shootings, as they call them. And the officer the attorney for the woman's family points out that, there are major discrepancies in how police described what happened and what was actually found at the scene in terms of, the alleged gun that they saw, whether or not she was holding it. And his response literally to these discrepancies and why he didn't investigate them was, it's not my job to Monday morning quarterback a shooting, right? It's like, that is exactly what your job is. That is precisely what you are supposed to be doing.
Right.
And you hear that, the Monday morning quarterback thing, you hear that all the time from like internal affairs officers. And it's like that is your job. That is what you're supposed to do. And they just think it's not their position to question whether another officer's actions were appropriate, even, when it resulted in the loss of an innocent life.
So it speaks. I mean, in my mind, it's about preventing officers from doing that in the first place. When we're talking about all these situations, it can be very difficult to do that in a political environment where, if you try to limit the authority of police, you're accused of taking away tools or endangering their lives and all of that kind of thing. What do you think would be the best approach to trying to limit police authority in those situations?
Oh man, I mean, better political leadership. I think, I wrote about, well, I did another piece in Little Rock about a progressive police chief who was hired there, and black guy, Keith Humphreys, and he, wanted to change the system there. Genuinely wanted to change the system, and one of the first things he did. And you want to talk about like police putting themselves in a situation where they have to use force, and how we look at those scenarios. There was a case in Little Rock where a police officer jumped in front of a car as somebody was trying to flee a traffic stop, and then shot and killed the driver when the car, continued to drive. And, that is a classic, example of police creating a dangerous situation. Also, there's never been a time in the history of automobiles where shooting and killing a driver is going to stop a car from moving in the direction it's moving, right?
Right.
It used to accelerate in that direction. You're not protecting yourself. Anyway, one of the first things Humphrey did was fired that officer. And that created this huge backlash. The police union, this is a city that has a police union and also has a black police union, which should, tell you something about the main police union. And they immediately went after Humphrey, who's black. And he ends up resigning in frustration. They started spreading rumors about like that he was sexually harassing white women, all of which were unfounded. I looked into this and wrote a really long series about it. But the problem was that when the city hired Humphrey, this is a black mayor, first elected black mayor in Little Rock history, and part of what he ran on was, he cited my series on the no-knock raids and said we're going to end that, and he said we're going to hire a progressive police chief to reform the police department. Problem is when the city council was not as reform minded. The problem is that the union had negotiated protections. The union represented everybody except the police chief. So when Humphrey took over, he could not hire his own, support staff. He couldn't hire his own managerial staff. So he had to, deal with 3 assistant chiefs, 2 of whom had applied for his job and didn't get it. Right. So from the start, he sort of, got everybody turned against him. The union just goes after him. So, I think Little Rock's a good example. I mean, they did actually cut down dramatically on the number of no-knock raids. I think it went from, over 100 per year to, I think, like less than 10, maybe even less than 5. But, a lot of Humphrey's reforms were undone. They ended up appointing a union-approved guy who'd been there forever. And part of that is just that, like, you need political leadership that, not only sort of understands these issues and knows the kinds of policies that need to be implemented to carry out reforms, but also understands how to argue and how to be persuasive on these issues to the public, right? Because, as we've seen, we had about 15 years of moving in the direction of reform. I don't know how much significant reform was accomplished, but during, the Obama era, approximately, there was significant movement in that direction. But it was easy to argue for reform at a time when crime was at historic lows. And the whole time I worried, and I think I wrote a couple things about this, what's going to happen because crime's not going to keep dropping forever. It's eventually going to go back up. And is this going to last? Or are we going to go right back to the 80s where, there's fear mongering and demagoguery? And it turns out we didn't even have to wait for crime to go back up. I mean, when Trump ran in 2016 and, with his American carnage inauguration speech and all the fear mongering he did, he inherited in 2017, when he took office, he had inherited the lowest homicide rate of any president since we began keeping records, right? So crime hadn't even gone up, and we were already rolling back reform just because, we had a candidate who, for whatever reason, was able to appeal to people's sort of baser instincts. Man, it's a really long and rambling answer, and I kind of forgot what the question was.
Well, I think you did answer it. And this is also my belief that it takes a reform-minded police chief, but also the people above that person need to be very invested in that reform as well, and also able to articulate the why. Yeah. Here's why we're doing this. And so a particular police chief who, and as you've described what happened in Little Rock, a police chief can't do it alone.
Yeah.
And here in Minneapolis, we have a system where the mayor is actually responsible for the police chief and is really, the city, we have what's called a strong mayor system. Mm-hmm. So the council really has no control over the police at all.
That's true in Little Rock too, but when the city council can take multiple no confidence votes in the police chief, that has an effect on public debate, even if they don't have the power to remove him.
Yes. So you mentioned your series on no-knock warrants. Where can people find that?
So that was at the Washington Post. It's called Little Rock's Dangerous Drug War, I think, or something like that. And then the series I wrote on Keith Humphrey and the police chief and the backlash against him was at The Intercept. I'm proud of both pieces. And the first one inspired some real reform and real policies. The second one did not. But I do think it sort of vindicated this guy who, had dealt with a lot and gone through a lot and endured a lot because he actually believed in reform and policies. But, one of the big things he did was promoted Black officers who had been overlooked for their entire careers. And, as he told me, and this is a common, refrain that we hear, but I think it's important to continue to say it given the era we're living in, which is that when for white people or for people who have benefited from discrimination their entire lives, ending that discrimination looks like discrimination against them, right? And so, Humphrey was subjected to multiple reverse discrimination lawsuits from white officers who, were not qualified to be in the position that they were in, who benefited from the kind of good old boy system. And so that's been a big problem too. And I think that's important because, I think diversity is important for diversity's sake. I think it's important that communities see themselves and their police and law enforcement, because I think that gives police and law enforcement more legitimacy in the community. But also, there's evidence that Black police chiefs, when you have a Black police chief, there's evidence that there are fewer shootings, fewer officer-involved shootings. And I think, the experience of being a Black person, Humphrey had experienced a lot of racial discrimination growing up. He had, he had seen, been in neighborhoods where there were high-profile police incidents. And also, women in police departments. There was just a study came out the other day that showed that women have a kind of ameliorating effect on the more toxic elements of police culture, from like discrimination to use of force and abuse. So, I think these policies, are important in having an accountable police department that can earn the community's trust. And that's how you fight crime. You cannot fight crime if you don't have the trust of the community you're serving. And, what we're seeing now with this immigration stuff, people are afraid to come forward. They're afraid to go to court. They're afraid to call the police to report crimes. And, I think we are going to see, increases in crime around the country because of this.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I wanted to shift focus to talk about George Floyd. Particularly, you wrote a series on kind of, this is generous, the reimagination of what happened to George Floyd, because we all know what happened to George Floyd. We saw the trial, that kind of thing. And along comes what's called Alpha News here, which originated in Minnesota, which is really the main person is married to the former head of the police union for the Minneapolis Police Department. But they put out, I don't know what you call it. I hesitate to call it a documentary. I'm not sure how to, but I want you to talk about that and your response to it.
Yeah. So, I'm going to provide a little context here again. There's this pattern that we see after one of these high profile police shootings, which is that everybody's outraged, and even, people on the right, law and order types, like, they won't try to defend the actual incident. They'll say, this is not indicative of all police,
The bad apple.
bad apple argument, right? And then, you see things start to change, and you see people start to peel off one by one, and, prominent sort of pundits and opinion makers and influencers start, questioning whether or not this officer was wrong to do this in the first place. And then soon you kind of get momentum. And, I think there are reasons for that. I think there have been cases where these incidents have been sort of wrongly reported at the outset, or there were details that weren't revealed. I also think they also often overlook the broader context. So, for example, the Ferguson protests, Michael Brown was the instigating incident that kind of lit the fuse, but what was happening in Ferguson had been boiling over for years, for generations, basically. That was just, the instigating incident. And that is important. I think every single time we've seen protests like we did after Ferguson, like we did after George Floyd, we always see a subsequent, whether it's media reports or a DOJ Civil Rights Division report that, surprise, surprise, the police department in the city where there were protests had been doing terrible things for a really long time, and people have been felt, oppressed and put upon and had their rights violated for a long time. Like, there's always, a lot bubbling under the surface when we see this kind of outburst. So, George Floyd happens. George Floyd is murdered. The videos come out. It's awful. Same reaction we've seen in other cases. Everybody's outraged. People on the right are saying this is not, indicative of police, as a whole. In fact, I think at one point I was scolded by a lot of people on Twitter because I suggested that, it was indicative of what we see from police as a whole. And it took a little longer this time, but, after about a year and a half, 2 years, we start to see this kind of reimagining, as you put it, retconning, I think as I put it in my series, of George Floyd's death and Derek Chauvin's role in it, and the other officers, I guess. But, Minneapolis is no different than these other cities. DOJ report comes out. It's jaw-dropping, just absolutely horrifying, what we had seen repeatedly from the Minneapolis Police Department, particularly in marginalized communities. But then people start peeling off, and we start to say, oh, well, George Floyd was addicted to drugs, and he had he had a criminal record, and I don't know, there were, various allegations, some of which were true, some weren't. None of that changes what happened, and none of that changes that video. None of that changes what we all saw. It was probably the most witnessed homicide in the history of the world, I would think, when you factor in, like, how many people watch those videos. But, if you can make people, as Orwell put it, disbelieve their own, lying eyes, that's you're a pretty powerful propagandist. And so the police defenders went to work, and like you said, there's this ex-journalist, I guess, and her former police union head husband, teams up with this newsy outlet. I think there's, if I'm not mistaken, there's an attorney involved who's also sort of tried to discredit, other reform-oriented in the country. And so, you get this documentary. And one thing I had been seeing in the Trump era was, I came kind of from the right, the political right on these issues. And since, I don't know if I migrated left so much as, realize that the only real threat in this country is coming from the right. But one thing I've seen is that people vaguely on the right, sort of common sense conservatives, libertarians who are interested in civil liberties, people who used to support my work and used to, agree with me about, the problems that we're seeing in policing. There was this bipartisan move toward reform, like I said, in the Obama era. And what Trump successfully did was he made crime and policing a culture war issue again. You're either on one side or the other. And so what I saw was a lot of people that had supported my work over the years now on, Facebook, social media, were, demanding that I answer to this, when Daniel Cameron, the Attorney General of Kentucky, held his press conference where he, called out people who were criticizing the shooting of Breonna Taylor, so many people who supported my work for a long time were sending me links to it and saying, how do you answer for this? And answer for this by, Daniel Cameron was lying and Deborah Scott Mertz, he lied about what happened. It's pretty clear. But I had noticed this happening. And so when this Fall of Minneapolis film, movie, documentary, whatever you want to call it, comes out, these same people start sending it to me and demanding that I answer for it. And I watched, the first 20 minutes or so of it, and I just didn't think it was serious enough to respond to. But then, people who were kind of more mainstream, not necessarily far right people, started picking up on it and started credibly reiterating the claims it made. And finally, it was Coleman Hughes, who writes for Barry Weiss's publication, The Free Press, and then Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter, who are two scholars who I don't agree with often, but I do think are serious people with serious, ideas. And they discuss it on their podcast, and they have Hughes on their podcast, and they give this documentary, a very sort of credulous airing, with nobody really to push back. And so finally I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to look into this. And so I looked at Hughes' column, and I watched the entire documentary. I looked at, some of the critiques of it online, and it was just one of those things where it's like, that it's going to take so much work to thoroughly debunk everything that's wrong with this. There's a principle, and I can't think of it off the top of my head. I mentioned in the series, some Italian guy came up with it, but it's this principle. It's the idea that the amount of effort it takes to disprove bullshit is like infinitely greater than the amount of effort it takes to spread bullshit. And so, but I thought this was important enough to do it. I mean, this is the most witnessed homicide probably in the history of the world. I think the George Floyd protests, for all the criticism they've received, I think they did more to move the ball on real substantive reform than any incident, any protest we've ever seen, particularly in terms of policing. Still not enough, still barely scratched the surface, but we did actually see real reforms. And this was an effort to roll all of that back. I mean, that's clearly what this was all about. So yeah, I started diving into it, and the Free Press sort of bills itself as this, heterodox, we're the only ones who really seek the truth, and that they ran this column in which Coleman Hughes just sort of, unquestionably accepted every preposterous thing that this documentary tried to argue. I actually got angry when I was reading it, because it was just so clearly bullshit. I mean, there was such clear propaganda. They were leaving out major aspects of the death investigation, major aspects of the training that Minneapolis officers received. And, I don't think we want to wade too far into the details, because it could get very wonky and heavy very quickly. But, I'd encourage people to read it if they want to check it out. It's at my Substack. But it was just, I don't know. To me, it was so obvious that the documentary was propaganda, that it was misleading people, that it was lying by omission. Some cases just flat out lying outright. And so, I ended up writing literally a 30,000 word series, kind of not just about Hughes' column, but I used that as kind of the entry point to pull the documentary apart and explain why what it was claiming was nonsense.
You and I talked in a previous conversation about this kind of being a new kind of propaganda. Can you talk about that?
Can you elaborate?
In terms of the police union?
Well, yeah. So, I think one thing we are seeing is the police unions are getting better at packaging their arguments in a way that sort of appeals to right-wing influencers, people online, Fox News, Newsmax. I think they're getting much better at that. I think police unions are the only public sector unions that, the right seems to love and embrace and not want to prohibit. But yeah, I think they've gotten much better at it. And I think that's a problem, because, I think police unions are one of the most obstructive forces in law enforcement, one of the most destructive forces in law enforcement in terms of opposing reform and really just preventing, when it comes to preventing unnecessary death. I mean, I remember maybe it's probably about 10 years ago now, a LA sheriff, I think it was the sheriff, or maybe it was a police chief, had proposed some sort of award to a police officer who could have used deadly force, but didn't, and ended up, preserving life. And, that could be a case like Tamir Rice, where it doesn't take a lot of courage to jump out of your car and shoot a kid as soon as you see him, because you're scared. It takes courage to hold your fire and make sure that the kid, is actually holding a gun before you open fire. And that was kind of the thinking behind this award. And the police union immediately scuttled the idea. They just raised hell over it. And, basically said that this is going to get police officers killed. And, the idea, police want us to think of them as brave and courageous. And, a lot of them are. I mean, a lot of them do, run towards danger, as they say. There've been lots of incidents where, a mass shooter was stopped by a courageous cop who just happened to be nearby. But by the same token, like I said, it doesn't take courage to shoot someone from, 100 yards away because you see they're holding something that could possibly be a gun, but you aren't certain, right? It takes courage to investigate, to hold your fire and see. And I think one of the things the police unions have done that's really destructive is they've basically made that entire sort of notion or idea impossible to argue, that it's, police should be allowed to shoot and kill, whenever they think there's danger to them, and that they should be able to kind of project the risk that they sign up for when they take the job. They should be able to project that back onto the community. And I think, that's a really dangerous notion.
I think in my experience, we have about 38 different law enforcement agencies in Hennepin County. And when you talk to individual police or police chiefs, they are much more open about what should be happening and shouldn't be happening. And I remember saying to a group of them at one point, you guys never speak up when something awful happens. And it would really be helpful for the community, because the community sees you as a monolith because something happens and you don't speak up. And I've concluded that a big part of that has to do with pressure by the police union. The police union has a narrative, and you don't want to get on the other side of that narrative. So even though they could be doing a lot of good by speaking up about why certain reforms are good, they just don't.
Yep. Norm Stamper, the former police chief in Seattle, I interviewed him for my Warrior Cop book, and he made a really good point, which is that, when cities are negotiating with police unions, and they don't have the budget to offer, more generous compensation, what they can offer instead is less accountability. And that, I think, is kind of a big part of the problem, right? Like, we're negotiating, and when you negotiate away accountability, what you're actually doing is negotiating away constitutional rights and constitutional protections. You're saying, we're going to make it easier for you to violate people's constitutional rights and get away with it. And I think that's one area where police unions, have really done a lot of damage.
Well, I want to wrap up by asking you, I know you put out another book that we didn't really get to talk about on forensics. What's the name of that book?
It's called The Cadaver King and the Country Dentist.
That should pique people's interest just based on the title. So I highly recommend.
That was the idea. Yeah.
Yes. And where can people locate you now?
So you can, my name's very Googleable, but radleybalco.substack.com is where my newsletter is. It's called The Watch. I write about these issues. I still do a lot of investigative reporting. And yeah, my new book should be out next year sometime. It's called The Defenders. It's looking at, I visited 21 public defender offices around the country, and kind of wrote about what it's like to be on the front lines at the criminal justice system. So,
and that's out early next year?
Probably mid-year, I think summer-ish. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.